Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's In the Artist Studio. I'm Elena Gross. I'm the Director of Exhibitions and Curatorial Affairs here at MOAD. And it's my pleasure today to be speaking and touring in virtual space with photographer and lens-based artist, Johnnie Chatman. Before we get to the conversation, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items. First off, for all of our audience members, please write into the chat or the chat on Facebook, wherever you're watching, and tell us where you're joining us from. This is a good way for us to kind of see where all of our audience is over this time while we're closed. MOAD's physical building may be closed due to the mandatory shelter in place, but you can still get your fill of art and artists of the African diaspora. Each Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific, join MOAD staff members like myself and my colleague Dimitri Broxton as we visit with some of our favorite artists in their studio to see what they're working on, how their work is changing as a result of the quarantine. This is a rare opportunity to hear from artists directly from their studios, and we will follow all talks with an audience Q&A. So at any point throughout the conversation, please feel free to drop your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A box. If you're on Facebook, someone will be monitoring that chat as well, and so they'll be transferring those questions over to Zoom. So feel free to drop your questions there as well. And please visit our website to see which artists we have coming up next. You can also go back and watch all of our past talks on MOAD's YouTube channel. The link will be provided. This series was made possible by generous donations from the Westridge Foundation, our wonderful MOAD members and viewers like you. Thank you all for your continued support. MOAD stands in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We honor and mourn the senseless murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Dante Wright, Tony McDade, and Ma'Khia Bryant. We mourn all of those who have lost their lives at the hands of police brutality and racial injustice, including those whose names we do not know. We want to acknowledge that MOAD's commitment to racial justice is ongoing, and as such, we will continue to say their names and hold space and honor these victims. We'd also like to give a land acknowledgement. Most of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples whose land we are located. With deep respect, MOAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, our people, our work, and our network servers are on native lands, and we thank the indigenous people of the Bay Area who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Lastly, if you have been enjoying this series or any MOAD programming, please consider donating to MOAD Online. Donations of any amount are always welcome. The link to where you can donate will also be in the chat. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured artist, Johnnie Chatman. Johnnie Chatman is a California lens-based artist currently residing in New York. He holds an MFA in photography, video, and related media from the School of Visual Arts. In fall 2021, he will be starting his Ph.D. in art history, theory, and criticism at the University of California, San Diego. Chapman's work has been featured in exhibitions across the United States, including at Fraenkel Gallery, HereArts, and SF Camerawork. His work can be found in Museum of Modern Art. In 2020, he was announced as a recipient of the En Foco Photography Fellowship. His work has been featured in publications including Dear Dave, Nueva Luz, and Zoetrope All-Story. He is also the founder and curator of Terms and Conditions, an experimental film screening series, which we'll talk about a bit later. Recent exhibitions include his solo exhibition, I Forgot Where We Were, at Blue Sky, the Oregon Center for the Photographic Art, I'm Not the Only One at Fraenkel Gallery, and Magnetic West, Enduring Allure of the American West at Figge Art Museum and Sioux Art Center. Welcome, Johnnie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for participating. I've seen your work in a few different places recently, and so I'm excited to get to kind of we hadn't met previously, so I'm excited to get to talk to you and dive into that a little bit more. Yeah, so I guess just to start out, where are we finding you today? Where are you joining us from today?
So right now I'm in Brooklyn, on land that was once lived on, loved, and maintained by the Munze Lenape tribe. And I kind of live here for a little bit, but I'm going to be relocating to California later this year.
And are you from Brooklyn originally, or from New York originally? Oh, I mean, no, I know you're from New York, but are you from the city originally?
No, I'm actually from Southern California.
Oh, you're just living in New York. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, born and raised in SoCal.
Oh, cool. So what, I guess, what has it been like sort of transition? Did you end up moving to New York in part due to work or due to the pandemic? What made you switch coasts for a bit?
So after I lived in SF for about 5 years. And then after living there, I decided to get my MFA and at School of Visual Arts. And so I ended up moving to New York. And then after graduating, I was fortunate to be able to get a role at Parsons School of Design, where I've been working for the past like 2 years. And that's kind of what's kept me in New York City.
And are you in your studio space, or are you in, is this your normal studio space, or is this your home, or some kind of hybrid?
I'd say more of like a hybrid working living space. Right now we're in my apartment in the living room, which is where I do a lot of like framing or host like critiques with friends and stuff like that. But I don't have a studio at the moment.
Okay. How has that been, I guess, over the course of, the last year or so without having access to kind of studio space? What did your practice kind of look like? How did it shift at all during that time?
In the beginning, it was very different. I spent the first kind of 3 months of the pandemic actually in California. I left the Friday before things shut down, which I was very lucky to be able to do that. I packed for the 2-week break and ended up being in California for 3 months,
Wow.
which was fun. And so during that time, I kind of went back to the basics of just kind of working, having just my laptop and my hard drive, and then returning to New York. Because of the lockdown and everything going on, a lot of my work requires travel. And so in respect of the local communities, I did not go shoot. And instead started to go through my archives and work on other series, and really think about the way in which I was situating the work.
Did that process, obviously it was necessitated in some part by, just by the reality of kind of like shut down, but did you find that process of kind of going back to the archive generated new ideas for what the future of, your practice could look like? Or did you find, were there things that you found in going back that seemed really germinating and exciting for you?
The pandemic kind of gave me time to work on other projects. I kind of always work on maybe like 2 to 3 series at a time. And this gave me a chance to really focus more of my attention on other projects. But it also, in going through and looking at the work, it made me really think about like, how was living in New York assisting that process? And if that was the place that I need to be in order to create the work that I wanted to create.
Yeah, I think a number of artists that we've talked to on here, but also just in general, like kind of the idea of slowing down as having been really, I don't know, being, a blessing in disguise in a certain way, in terms of like really being intentional in the way that artists think about their practice and many artists who kind of were in the speed of turning out many products or projects a year in this sense of productivity, then kind of taking a much more relaxed sounds like the wrong word, but just a slower time and more intentional contemplative time with the work that they were doing. And it sounds like that was kind of similar for you in a certain way by like then kind of paring down a bit.
Yeah, during the last year, I thought a lot about that concept of kind of like time poverty and the way in which like we are kind of put into the system due to capitalism, where we're kind of always going and we don't really have this time to really think about the conditions in which we are going, and what else is going around. And so having that space to really think about what I was doing and why, and also not forcing myself to create or to continue to make if I was not inspired at that moment. So giving myself the freedom to create as it felt necessary, rather than to create in order to like be seen or to have a show or to do something.
Right.
Which I think is a very like different experience that we don't always get to have.
Yeah. You kind of showed us a little bit of your space before. I don't know if there's anything else you want to show us of your kind of working space before we move on.
I can give you a quick like tour. So it's mainly just like our living space. So I have my Monstera plant. We have our plant wall, a library of photo books and art books that are color coded.
Oh, cute. I tried to do that. It didn't last. I didn't have the discipline.
I live with two artists, and so one of them, Jonathan, is very particular about like organization.
Oh,
So this
yeah.
is maintained. And then our plants, which are thriving because up above, I don't know if you can see, there's a skylight.
Beautiful.
And so this is kind of like a nice space to kind of come and work to get a little bit of the outside while you're being inside.
So what's a typical day, I guess, in your space in terms of your making practice these days? What does a typical kind of studio day look like for you?
Kind of ranges. So usually I'm kind of working on concepts or ideas or jotting down notes as I'm working, because I also work for full-time at Parsons School Design. And then once I am done with that, then I usually am either working on other projects, experimenting with like printing and things like that, and organization, uh, or just going through my archive. I have so much imagery that has never really seen the light of day because of things that were happening previously, and really going through and recategorizing it and just looking at it again. Because sometimes we look at work and we think this is bad, and then we go back and look at it again, and you're like, wait, what? This is like amazing. Why did I cast this aside in that moment? So really like taking a fresh eye to things.
Well, I want to jump into seeing some of your work, so I'm gonna go ahead and show some of it, and then we can kind of just move through some of your most, or this first series that I feel like I was sort of introduced to your work through the exhibition that you were part of at Fraenkel Gallery last summer, last fall, last year, basically. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And so I wanted to begin here in part because what struck me about these works is the rightful inclusion of such work in that exhibition is kind of the quiet solitude of the figure in these images, like the lone figure standing as a silhouette in this expansive landscape. It feels like to me, it immediately, reminds me of Caspar David Friedrich and sort of the Ricken figure, and like that, it calls back this very specific art historical, canonical history of landscape painting and of the sublime, but obviously from a completely different subject position, from a Black subject position. And so I was wondering, how does your work speak to this legacy or this history, and how do you see yourself updating or complicating that narrative within your work?
So I, over the course of working on this series, really looked at the history of not just landscape photography, but the history of landscape in art, and what it was used for, both within the art world, but in greater context. And then use this as a chance to have this conversation about like, how does the Black experience kind of fit into this narrative in the ways that it's either been left out, whether intentional or not, and then how does that relate to the actual history of the place, like what actually is going on, who was there and why. And so then using this series, which at this point I've been working on for almost a decade,
Wow.
has a chance to really investigate like this iconography, and have this ongoing conversation.
I think something that's also interesting to me, and why I brought up silhouette, is that there's a way that at first when you're looking at one of these images, it almost feels like the figure is a little cutout, that there's been some sort of manipulation to the actual physical object of the photograph, and then your eyes adjust and you see that this is a figure in inside of the photograph. Like this is a figure in the foreground or the middle ground or wherever. And I think that sort of inside outside kind of movement is really interesting, especially in thinking about being a Black viewer, or, you know, art love, just a Black viewer looking at, you know, this kind of very specific history of white male figures in the landscape. It's like suddenly there is the opportunity to kind of fit yourself into the landscape where once it maybe felt removed from, like you maybe once felt removed from that possibility.
Yeah, so I approached the figure in kind of a couple different ways. So one of the ways that I thought about the figure and the way in which it interacts with the landscape and it is interpreted by the viewer is this idea of the way in which Blackness as a concept is often presented in these kind of flattened narratives and perspectives. So starting with this kind of idea of a silhouette, and then from a silhouette, which is a Black shape, then going to the detail of it being a Black man, and then going into the detail of reading the title and other information that then asserts that that figure belongs to the artist. And so then we build depth as each time we reread the image. That kind of forces us to really think about like what the figure is, what it represents, who the figure is, why are they there? And that brings up these interesting conversations around the flattening of the figure, whether people choose to then acknowledge it or not acknowledge it in their view of the landscape.
Yeah. And so what was your relationship to, you know, you mentioned earlier that you grew up in Southern California. So what was your relationship to nature and landscape growing up, just as an individual, but then also how did it first start showing up in your practice? When did you know that you wanted to really focus on landscape?
Yeah, so I grew up in Claremont, which is at the base of the foothills, at the base of Mount San Antonio or Mount Baldy. And so growing up there, like the West was literally like at our footsteps, but it was also a place where, you know, I was in 6th grade and was watching the fires come down like every year. And half of our town, if you go closest to the mountain, you can see where it burnt half of the city. And so grew up with this idea of nature as this beautiful place, but also this kind of like threatening environment. And then from there, I used to travel a lot to like Las Vegas. So going through the desert, really thinking about like what the desert represented, thinking about its relationship to the military. And then once going into undergrad is when I really started to focus more on landscape as a concept. Because before that point, I did a lot of abstract painting. I was really into filmmaking, fashion photography, and then there was this like switch. And I had worked on this project called Between the Sea and the City that was about the military installations that are around San Francisco, which like a lot of people have photographed. But I paired it with this writing where I was really thinking about the kind of paradox of a city like San Francisco, which is known as this kind of liberal haven, but that has one of the most intense like military like fortifications around it. Like so many things are tied to the military. To have places like Baker Beach, which is where like, you know, the birthplace of Burning Man, but there's literally like a military fort right there with like an artillery gun. And the way in which people either recognize it and don't. And then for a period of time, I lived out by Fisherman's Wharf. And so I looked at Alcatraz and Angel Island, and looking at Angel Island and looking at the way that it was situated, and then looking at the historical photographs, and you start to realize that like there used to be a military fort on Angel Island, and then they had changed the top of it in order to make it like a base. And then they had, once they no longer needed that, they like changed it back. And then starting to think about the way in which a lot of what's natural, what seems natural around the Bay Area, like is not. But it's presented that way in this kind of like paradox of the two. And then that led me to working on to other series.
That's interesting in thinking about kind of this relationship between kind of the aesthetic documenting of a space and like the history of a space, and how a photograph preserves in certain ways, or seemingly preserves, a moment in time as it exists. But then as things change, it completely complicates what the image means or what the landscape means. And it seems like your work is really investigating that sort of like, how do you document history without it being like or how do you document history in time without it necessarily being this authoritative, while also acknowledging that this space, this context has changed and will change over time as well. Do you see that as being part of what you're approaching in this work that you do?
Yeah, and so that kind of ties in with the way in which the figure is presented. So having this figure kind of faced away, wearing kind of like a similar attire. And so then it creates this kind of like instability. So I'll have people talk to me about the work. And then when I explain that like this is over like 9 years, it's not like a recent, then you start to relook at the work and really think about like the way in which the figures change, the way in which the landscape itself has changed, what is being preserved, and the way in which we look at photographs always in the present, and how that affects our interpretation of the work. And then with being really interested in history and this kind of change, there's always a struggle of not wanting to be overly didactic with the work.
Right.
So figuring out ways to leave clues, information inside of it, to point at things in the way that a camera can, but leaving it up to the viewer to interpret it.
So I also want to talk a bit about what we were starting to talk about, you in thinking about specific histories of violence, even perhaps within a space. I want to think about talk about the intersections of race and place. I feel like, you know, when we start to have these conversations around the landscape and the landscape in regards to race, specifically within Black community or Black identity within the United States, the conversation often focuses primarily or solely on the American South. But as we know, the West, and especially the California landscape, is incredibly loaded and fraught with histories and legacies of racialized violence. And there's a very whitewashed mythology that kind of comes along, that's perpetuated, that goes along with the idea of the American West as a place, but also as like kind of a symbol in American culture. And so I was wondering if, I mean, it sounds like this is something you spent a lot of time thinking about, but I was just wondering if you could talk about that in, you know, not only as you having grown up in the American West in this kind of very specific, you know, American West context, but also in the way that you are presenting the landscape in your work and how you're thinking about those.
Yeah, so one of the things that was really interesting to me in creating this work was really going into the archives, really going into the history of these locations. Because we're often, in particular, the Black experience in the United States is often presented in these kind of almost like soundbite, iconicized ways where we go from the early days of slavery in the South, and then it just like jumps to the civil rights movement. And then we go to present day, and there's kind of like, well, what happened in this period of time? What happened in the West? And why is it only being presented through this specific lens? And as we start to go through and look at history, it gets much more complicated. Things get much more complicated when you find out that, you know, the first National Park Rangers were an all-Black military unit known as the Buffalo Soldiers, who were stationed in San Francisco. And so they were the ones that were the first park rangers, and everything that the park rangers do now are modeled after them. And that participation, it changes when you look at the history of the environmentalist movement and its connection with eugenics. And you tie that into like John Muir and this concept of wilderness. And it was only last summer that the Sierra Club finally publicly recognized that about like 3 of their 7 founding members were believers of eugenics. They were part of that movement. And that affects why things are being represented, who was accessing it. in the way it's been preserved and being presented today and not being challenged. And then when you start to go through more of the history of the West, you start to see all of these other narratives and stories. Like, no one ever talks about the Harlem Renaissance on the American West, the artists, the Black artists who were there, the creators who were there. Nobody talks about like Oscar Micheaux, who's like a Black filmmaker who had his own studio and was creating Western films. So there's this whole other history that is never spoken about, even down to the idea of the concept of the cowboy. Like, during the height of the West, 1 in 4 cowboys were Black, with the others being the Spanish vaqueros and the indigenous cowboys. And like that whole narrative kind of shifting of like how things are being represented, and then challenging it, because it's one of the forms I find within the art world that is always taken at face value when it should be challenged.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much unpacking to do from not only from an art historical level, but from American history level, but from a lens, through the lens of race, through the lens of gender, through the lens of the environment. And it's funny, yeah, but it feels, even now, kind of the myth of the American West feels, even though people are we're starting to pull these threads apart, it does feel a little bit untouchable in certain ways, because it's this image that, and it really does feel like a very, more than almost any other American myth, it feels like a very visual kind of myth that just, it's a very specific image that lives in people's heads, that we kind of, how do we counter kind of the weight and the impact of that image with further knowledge, I suppose, with other alternative sites of knowledge, I suppose.
Yeah, it's hard because the concept of the American West is something that is distinctly American. And it is something that today is like a leading cultural export. Like, people come to kind of live this fantasy of what this is, but the American West as a construct only lasted 1 generation. And so, like, kind of like the Civil War, which lasted like 4 years, we have this other thing that only lasted a very short period of time, but in so many ways changed like American identity. Like, that's where the whole idea of, we need to go out and make it on our own, and leaving family to move to different cities, like all of these ideas that now represent like the American dream came out of this period, but then was like never challenged.
Yeah.
And there are people who are challenging it and expanding upon it, but it's hard when it's also like, these are tourist destinations, these are places that are being like marketed to the masses, and there's a lot of money involved with that. And so not everyone wants to challenge that, because there are these other things associated with it.
So with a lot of the sites in this particular body of work, and I will be completely honest that I'm a novice when it comes to the California landscape, and when it comes to like understanding wilderness in the American West. I've only been on the West Coast for about 7 years. But in so many of these places seem remote to me as a person who's a novice who doesn't know that much about it. But I was wondering, are these necessary? Like, do you specifically, in your researching a site before documenting it, is that what you're searching for? Is like a remoteness, or are you looking at places that are perhaps actually populated in a certain way, but then kind of removing the rest of like what exists out beyond the frame, to kind of challenge what we think of when we think of like wilderness and like remoteness, and the idea of like isolation and solitude within the landscape?
I think first, I would sort of challenge the idea of wilderness.
Yeah, that's why I keep.
Yeah. Because it sort of implies that these areas were uninhabited or unlived in. And you have people like John Muir writing about the expansiveness of this. And John Muir was writing this as Indigenous Americans were being removed from the area.
Right.
So like these were never really uninhabited places. And for it to be wilderness, but there's a road to get to it. There's like a fence, like then it's not really wilderness. But in researching the locations, I looked at visual media, so whether it's photography, whether it's filmmaking. So some of the places actually refer to places that were iconicized by like the films of John Ford, and others that were creating this kind of public relationship to the American West. I look at social media to see like where are people going today and how are they interacting with these spaces? Like what is being made popular to them and why? And then I go to the spaces. So I do a lot of research beforehand. I have like a folder with like places in every single state.
That's why you gotta keep organized. That's why that bookshelf is so structured.
I love research. And so I will look up a lot of what's going on at these places in both in the past and present, and then we'll go out and create something from that. But some of the places that seem remote, it's like an illusion. You know, like the shot at Monument Valley, the John Ford Point. If you were to turn the camera like this one, so if you were to turn the camera to the right, you would see a person who's like waiting on a horse to go out to the end of this to take a photograph that everybody takes because it's from the John Ford films and was also a spot that was popularized by the Lone Ranger, which in itself, the Lone Ranger is actually thought to be based on the real life person Bass Reeves, who's a black sheriff, who in the films is presented as white. And that's its own thing. But there's often this paradox of these places being presented as remote, but like, if you were to go to the left, you would see a hotel. And if you were to go right, you would see stands and cars. So it's like a bit of a myth in itself. And some of the locations. Go ahead.
No, you finish your thought.
Some of the locations themselves appear as natural. Like I have an image of myself at a waterfall. It's called the Cascade Falls. But the falls themselves are runoff water from a mine that's further up on the mountain. So then even then it's like not really nature.
Right. It's interesting in just kind of in many images and depictions of the American West, and the idea of the Lone Ranger, even there's always this idea of this one solitary figure, but who goes out into nature ultimately as a means of conquering it, essentially, of kind of claiming it for humanity, claiming it for America, claiming it for white America. But I think what's really interesting about these images is the scale. Like you really think about there's the smallness of the figure in comparison to the environment, and so it feels like it's also kind of subverting that expectation that man ultimately the purpose of this is to conquer, to tame it in a certain way. There's more of a relationship between the figure and the environment they find themselves.
Yeah, I really try to look at the space, when we think about like the work of like Casper David Friedrich and Men on the Precipice, and kind of the way in which that presented this kind of idea of colonization, this man who's standing above the land and everything's kind of mysterious and he is going to go out and like conquer it. But really think about like what did that meant for the sort of Black experience in the United States, for these people who were enslaved and then were free. What was the landscape that they were interacting with? What did that mean? And then also thinking about like the lack of these bodies and these stories in this place. And not just necessarily just Black bodies, but like there were a lot of stories. These places were never these kind of like neutral spaces. And so these kind of like ghosts of a figure that's there, that's like been there, but is like not ever like referenced. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. I think there's something very like you using the word ghost is interesting because I was thinking about this before. There's something kind of spectral about, and sort of other spectral feeling about when you look at these images, there is this sense of all of the various figures, all of the various stories, all of the various lives that have existed in this place that we can't see. And like this one figure as like a stand-in almost for the vastness of that unknowable kind of history and an unknowable future as well. And there feels like there's something very beautifully like metaphysical about that.
I wanted, as I sort of was working on the series, I kind of thinking about like Kara Walker and the way in which she talked about her work, and she realized that people came to interpret her work and interact with her work like through her body, and that her body was this lens in which people interacted with the work. And then that was something that I ended up experiencing, and that like having this figure there changed our relationship to the image and our relationship to that kind of like history. And so then wanting to have it be kind of this kind of body of multiplicity, so wanting the body itself to be something unstable. And so by facing away, it makes it harder to figure out like what age I was when I took it. So then it's always me, but at the same time, it's like not me at that moment. But giving it some type of cohesion also within the series, so that if I work on it for 30 years, you don't know if I took the photo a week ago or 10 years ago.
And do you work, I just, in thinking about, you positioning yourself in these images, both in front of and behind the camera, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that process and what the process is actually like of capturing these images. Do you work with assistants, with teams of other people? How exactly, like, what is your kind of relationship to photographing yourself in these spaces?
It depends on the trip. Quite often, I am actually alone. So like the Salt and Sea subset, I was entirely by myself shooting this, and often had to listen to the trigger of the shutter to know when I was taking a photograph. Sometimes, depending on the location and its popularity, I will have someone go with me, so that they can stay by the camera and protect that as I go out. This often requires waiting, either for people or other things to leave, and then really situating myself in perspective to the camera.
So with that, there's always an element of chance, it sounds like, in sort of how things are going to turn out. I feel like also in thinking about these places, and especially in thinking about going out into these spaces alone, there also feels like there's naturally, as you were talking about before, in terms of growing up and thinking about the fires coming down, there's like this place of serene beauty, but there's also this space of danger or possible danger. And I was just wondering how you think about danger, not only in terms of the actual experience of being in these spaces, but how you think about chance and danger and the danger of not getting the shot, even in terms of like how you think about like the aesthetics of your work as well, or how you think about how you conceptualize your practice.
Yeah, so there's always it's sort of an element of risk. And my mother did not like me working on this series for a period of time. So to go out into these locations where, Salt and Sea, which is pictured here, there's no cell phone service. When you're out there, you are at the mercy of whoever you come across. If anything happens, like no one's going to really know. And I've been in places where like I was able to park my car in the middle of a road and nobody passed by for like 2 hours. So like really remote locations. And so being prepared about what to expect and what's around, and very much keeping my eye open, so that I know what's happening around me at all times. But also being open to the idea of whatever picture I had in my head or whatever idea of what that's going to be like is not going to be how that actual location is.
Right.
Like we look at photographs from people like Ansel Adams, and people go to Yosemite thinking that it's going to look like this, and like it's not going to look, it's never going to look like that. Like that is not reality.
Right.
And so then looking at these works and then being like, what does the actual space look like? And then adjusting my image and what I want to create based off of what happens. Sometimes I have an idea of a place I want to shoot, and then I go there and it's like, it's not there. Like the object's not there, the building's not there. I was working on this series and I had shot this building that was starting to fall apart, went back like 8 months later, and the building had completely collapsed in on itself. So like you literally can no longer create that image. And some of the places within it, it just straight up no longer looks like that. So just kind of being open to this idea of change and spontaneity, and kind of being open to adjusting your perspective on the fly, like when I'm there.
And so you mentioned Kara Walker just a bit ago, but I'm curious about who some of your other, either other photographers or other lens-based artists, or just who are some of the other, your other influences that you think about or that you carry with you when you're making.
So it ranges. Lately, I've been thinking about the work of David Wojnarowicz, Pipon Osario, who's like an installation artist, Elliot Porter and his landscape work, David Horvitz and his more conceptual interpretations in relationship to the image. I've been looking at Wendy Red Star, who's another person who's expanding our idea in iconography of the West. And then, of course, people like Anna Mendiata, and the way in which she used her body as this vehicle to have a conversation with the landscape, as well as Christian Boltanski and ideas of the archive.
Yeah, that's a stacked list. I'm mostly asked because I'm always fascinated by who people are in conversation with, even just in their head, even if it isn't immediately obvious in the work itself. And so I think that's a really exciting list. And I can see so many of those influences, or see so many of those conversations, especially in thinking about the use of the body, the use of one's own body, especially in the work, and kind of the risks that come along with that. So that's cool. I want to give us time to look at a different series. So I'm gonna stop this for a moment and go to your website.
Can I add on one thing to your last comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
So thinking about like, who we're in conversation with, I had a really interesting conversation with an artist where I used to consider myself as kind of a part of a certain lineage, having a conversation with the history of landscape photography. And this artist was kind of like, no, you really need to think about yourself in the way in which you're using your body in relation to the landscape. And so thinking about like Anna Mendiata, Ai Weiwei's flipping off of monuments. I believe his name is perhaps Sing Swang Shea, who is an artist in New York who wore a General Mao outfit and took a lot of portraits of himself around different iconography.
I love that series.
Because one of the things that happened is this idea of the vocabulary of the medium. So like landscape photographers don't take portraits of themselves. So then you need to be looking at this other kind of conversation as well. And that kind of changed how I really looked at the work and my ideas behind it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Even just that last point about landscape photographers not taking photos of themselves, kind of in thinking about even like documentary filmmakers who aren't present in visually, at least in their work, and sort of that relationship between the idea of authority. But I think it speaks to positionality, obviously, as we know, is so important to how we think about a space and how we think about how a work is presented. And so, yeah, it's an interesting, I hadn't thought about the fact that you don't see landscape photographers in their work very often, and what the purpose of that probably is in terms of the work that they're, and the reception of the work itself. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna show your. Let me just make sure this is pulled up. Great. So I wanted to look at this series titled How Grand, mostly because I thought, you know, this was one of the series that I looked at on your site, and just kind of getting to know your practice a little bit, that immediately struck me in terms of how visually different it is from the work that we just saw previously. And there are a couple of moving image works that I wanted to show. So I'll give this one, I'll play this one, and then we can chat about it a little bit. I can't remember if this one has sound or not, but yeah, it does. So oh wait, oh, sorry. I stopped sharing too soon. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. If you want to go ahead and start describing discussing the nature of the series, I'll go ahead and pull it back up in just a second.
Yeah, so How Grand was a visual study that I worked on during the time I was working on my MFA. The work is comprised of about 13,000 photographs that were collected from Instagram from people who were tagging the Grand Canyon. And so at this time, I really wanted to have a conversation about the way in which people interact with these spaces and how it's become to this point where it's no longer really about the experience of the landscape when you're in person. It's about the collection of imagery. And so it's about the representation of this space in digital format. And so then collecting all of these photographs and then basically creating this like kind of intense, kind of artificial feeling of this piece where as it gets towards the end, the images actually start to break down to the point where like I was working with Premiere Pro and it would literally collapse on itself and shut down. And these artifacts would start appearing. And then I had the chance to exhibit it on location. And it created this really interesting conversation about forcing people into this kind of artificial space where they then actually stop to appreciate the environment. And at the time when I was able to present it on location, I think it's one of the images on my website. It was presented alongside of a lake. And so you had these very artificial colors and tones and the actual artifacts of the digital file in an explicitly like natural, quote unquote, environment.
Right. I think something, so when you first began, when we first started talking, you were kind of telling us about your background. I hadn't realized that you had previously been, you mentioned abstract painting, which was something that was so that was kind of, that was one of the immediate draws for me to this, is the idea of taking this concept of the Grand Canyon, this very well-known image that exists in people's minds, and completely abstracting it in a through this kind of repetitive, you know, we've looked at this so many times that we don't even know what we're looking at anymore, which seems really interesting. And I think that's a really like interesting kind of conversation to be having right now, as we're all kind of immersed in thinking about like Instagram, thinking about the way that images kind of appear in the digital space, that like we get so consistently used to seeing things that we almost like don't see them any longer. Like it blurs in a certain sense, it breaks down. Is this, in a way, were you thinking about your previous history as a painter or as interested in abstraction when creating this work? Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about, so I kind of always work on multiple projects at once, and one is, this black and white self-portrait project, but then there's always usually this very like colorful, abstract piece that kind of lets me have a different conversation. And most of my time during my MFA was actually spent working on creating experimental filmworks, and working really in that medium. And this kind of gave me a chance to have this conversation with the landscape and thinking about the way in which social media has impacted our relationship to these spaces. Especially as I go out and I work on this series and I've seen the change in which people interact with the spaces, where it's no longer really about the space itself, but the collection of imagery. And then you go on social media to the point where there's an Instagram account that they compare like 12 to 15 images, and it's like the exact same framing. The people are wearing the exact same outfit, and it's like no longer really about the space, but this kind of like digital construct.
I also want to give you, I'm going to stop asking questions so we can get to Q&A. Talk about the film series that you also curate, Terms and Conditions. I'll just click on it since we're here, but yeah, if you wanted to just talk about how this, tell us a little bit about how this series developed, and what it's like, how your curating practice of experimental film work informs your individual artistic practice.
So one of the things, when I was starting to work on experimental films and installation work, I always wanted to create these other avenues for other artists to have space to present their work, and to be shown. And one of the things that happens with people who are working in experimental film is that there's not really a lot of avenues for this, whether it's like even the galleries or exhibitions or film screenings. There's like not really a lot of spaces for that, for them to be able to show their work. And so I wanted to create this avenue for people to come together and just look at work. And so over the process of working on this series, I usually partner with another visual artist. So last summer, I partnered with a colleague of mine, Liz Zito, who's a performance artist / filmmaker. And we curated a 5 consecutive week film screening series that showed the work of about like 8 to 10 artists from around the world, that we would just cold call and be like, we want to show your work.
Oh, wow.
As this kind of chance to, at the beginning of the pandemic, people didn't really have opportunities to see work. So giving them a chance to look at work that maybe was previously published, but like doesn't really get a lot of chances to be seen, to give them a spotlight.
And are there plans to continue a similar series going forward? Yeah.
Yeah, the goal is to at least do it once a year.
Once a year.
We kind of took a break because curating the 5-week series was a lot. Yeah. But there are plans to hopefully do it again this year and do another either virtual screening. I would love to do one in person when it feels right. To continue it and to bring more people in, to either help co-curate or to be involved with the exhibition, with the presentation of the work.
That's exciting. I look forward to seeing it. Hopefully, if it's virtual, I look forward to being able to see it. I want to transition now to our audience Q&A. We have a few questions in the Q&A box immediately. So the first question comes from Cynthia Rose, and it says, in your work, is there a theme of the Black man as being alienated from and subsumed by his environment?
For me, no. Because I don't feel that this landscape is not a part of the history of Black experience. I don't feel like it's kind of separate. So I never feel kind of alienated. In actuality, when I'm there, it's very peaceful and meditative, and for my relationships with the environment.
Thank you. So the next question is from Joan. It says, what is the distance between you and the camera on average in the images we are seeing? You kind of touched on this a little bit, but.
It depends. Quite often it's about 20 to 30 feet, but there have been ones where I've been up to like 300 feet away. And I have a radio remote control that allows me to be at greater distances. And if I need to be even further away, then I usually have somebody standing near the camera.
The next question is from Dimitri. Have you considered using a place like Allensworth, the first African-American town in California, as a site of interrogation?
No, but I will. I will definitely. I will add that to my book.
Yeah. Next question from Joan as well is also, is this digital or film, and what is your photo development process?
I only shoot digital for the series. And the process is kind of, it doesn't stop once I've taken the image. So there are things that are sometimes changed in order to get, or removed in order to get the image that I would like. And sometimes the images aren't released until I am comfortable with the image. So I have like, right now in the series, there's probably about 45 images, and there's 10 that are just chilling.
Yeah. Well, you were saying that, you know, you've like, when you were going back through, have you found any works from this series that you thought, you know, didn't work or weren't going to make it in, that you've reconsidered since during this time of kind of going back and looking through your own archive?
Yeah, there's, I did some work at Yosemite, and also when I was shooting in the Pacific Northwest, like at the very beginning days of the project, that I go back and forth with, but I think that there's something to that imagery, and I'm just finding a way of placing it into the series, whether I reshoot it or I use the original.
Yeah, and you were also saying that, you know, you would sometimes revisit a space and, you know, the space is completely changed, but have there been spaces that have taken on a new resonance after that you found after, you know, visiting them? Like, I wonder, are there places that, I'm just thinking about like how much has changed over the last year, like even thinking about walking around Mission Street in San Francisco feels very different now than it did. You felt while you were making the work that now has taken on a new, feels like it has a new, something is different about it now when you encounter the work?
I think, I mean, there's the image of Monument Valley that's always very interesting to see how people interact with it. Because I actually went back, I think around two to three times to that location. And it was only on the second trip that I got an image that I liked. There are some locations that I went to that I had a certain idea in my head of what it was going to be like. And then I got there and had an experience that made me leave within like 10 minutes. And I did not create an image of it. So it kind of depends.
The next question is also from Dimitri. It says, are these images printed at a very large scale, or is that a specific consideration for you? What is the scale like of the work when it's presented?
So the works usually come in two sizes. Until now, I haven't really had the opportunity to present the work in its full form, because ideally a lot of these images are meant to be presented at their kind of like around 4 to 5 foot range, so that you can see a little bit more detail in the figure, and also sometimes there's hidden details in the landscape itself that are not as viewable at a small scale. But I have presented the work at, I think it's like 12 by 18 inches as well. But going forward, I want to make bigger pieces.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like has been one of the most consistent things I think I've heard from artists over specifically over this last period of time, is just like everybody wants to work bigger, which I really appreciate. I love the idea of artists working really large and taking up more, like feeling like they can take up more space. I don't know. That's something that feels like very like, that's on a lot of people's minds right now. And that I find that really exciting. But so the next question from an anonymous attendee says, being in the American West, being in these mostly vacated landscapes, do you come in contact with migrants? I wonder about the new communities that are continually passing through these same spaces.
I don't know if I worry about, like anyone in that kind of regard. I am always open up to conversation. So I've gone to spaces where I have met people that like live, sort of off the grid living, and being kind of open to being like, well, how do you experience this landscape? And wanting to see like how other people who actually live in these areas are interacting with the space. The other thing that comes in that I think is more of the concern is looking at how tourists are interacting with these spaces and both their regard and disregard of the local communities in order to get certain images. So I have been to spaces that, because of social media, there's places like the Wave in Arizona, which is completely locked down. They only allow about 10 to 20 people to go visit on a day. They will not tell you where it's at because they don't want people to come because of social media, because they know that people will destroy that habitat. And then on the other side, you have places like Horseshoe Bend, which were not maintained by the National Park Service. It's on Navajo reservation land. And this place used to only have maybe like, 1,000, 5,000 people that ever came to it. And now it's having 100,000 people, and wow, they're having to deal with that. And when I went, I was there for 10 minutes before leaving because I'm standing there looking at the location, watching people interact with the space. And I see a man, he's holding onto the straps of like this woman who looks like she has like a backpack on her chest. And she's leaned over the edge of a cliff in order to get a photo of the canyon. But when you go to the side, you realize it's not a backpack. There's a baby strapped to her chest.
Oh God.
Just to get a photograph that you can go on Wikipedia and get the exact same photograph. But like people putting themselves out there, like, yeah.
Ooh, yeah, that would be rough. Yeah, I don't, encountering, oh yeah, that kind of, sorry, that one tripped me up, the baby in the backpack and like kind of the unnecessary, yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what to say to that one.
I mean, like you're more likely to die nowadays taking a selfie than to get struck by lightning.
Yeah.
And like the amount of people who are dying at national parks because they are turning their backs to cliffs in order to get like a self-portrait. There's been many people who've died at Yosemite. There have been people who died where I grew up near Mount Baldy. There's usually about 2 or 3 people who die like every year hiking this trail. And so really thinking about, because of social media and image capture, people are almost disassociated from the actual experience of the landscape. And they don't see there as being that kind of danger that we spoke about, that like you shouldn't stand on the edge of a shale cliff because it's shale and it will give way.
Yeah. Well, also I think speaks to also what we've been talking about this whole time in terms of this, this myth of the American West and like this desire, this desire that can never be attained to like be a part of this fantasy of wanting to see yourself as part of this fantasy, to see yourself as kind of the star of your own Western in your own head, and what that kind of desire will actually, like what it'll drive you to or blind you to in a certain way. Like that's really interesting. So the next question comes from Shauna Sherman, and it says,
Elena, you may have to repeat that.
Oh,
yeah, I think it cut out first. Okay.
The question is, could you talk more about your research and how it informs your process?
Yeah, so I do a lot of research, whether it's visually, so going through archives, local archives, national park archives, um, looking to see what's been documented, then looking at the history of photography, the people who have been celebrated or pushed into the canon, and looking at what work they created and why and how it was being used. But then also looking at, you know, the history of film, like what's been made there and why, looking at um, poetry, writings of historical accounts of these spaces, um, and using all that to kind of like get an idea of the space. And as part of what I'm going to be doing with the PhD is actually going to be writing about that.
So I think that's a great segue into Shauna's next question, which is, do you have a theory of place? Is that something that you are working on or plan to be working on in your dissertation work or just in your doctoral work?
That's something we'll be working on because I really want to talk about the intersection of landscape with colonization, with the history of eugenics, and also with things like ontological expansion and the kind of notions of who gets to be where, why they're there, and thinking about also the way in which Black art, where it is created, the spaces that are created in conversation with these kind of other stories of the landscape. You know, thinking about like when a Black or POC artist does a project that is about their city and it's about their landscape, it's thrown into the documentary category. But then when a landscape photographer does it, it's all of a sudden about like suburbia and it's Stephen Shore and Western expansion, but we're not talking about white flight. We're not talking about these other things that are behind it. And so really looking at the iconography, but also the language that goes with it.
Yeah. So we have about 4 minutes left. I like to leave the last bit of all of the conversation, if there are no additional questions, for if there's anything, any shows or any projects that you have coming up that you want to plug. I love a good plug to end things with. What do you have coming up in the next few months?
For the most part, it's going to be pretty quiet. I'm giving myself a little bit of a break because this past year was one of a lot of growth and expansion. I had a lot of firsts. And so I'm giving myself a little bit of a break before I dive into the PhD.
Yeah. Was there anything in the past year that perhaps we didn't get, didn't get the fanfare it could have because of COVID that you want to highlight?
I would highlight the Magnetic West show that was at the Figge Museum because they put together a great catalog of artists that are working in the West from the past to present, and really talking about who is doing the change and what were the kind of narratives that have been put forward. And also, like as a plug, that was the first time someone's ever like written about my work in kind of like
cool.
art historical context. And the scene being presented in that conversation was really cool.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today, Johnnie. It was nice meeting you. It was nice getting to look at your work and to really dive into this conversation and to dive into a lot of these themes. There are themes that I think about a lot that come up for me a lot in terms of the work that I look at and the work that I do. So I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you participating in MOADS in the Artist Studio. And I want to thank everybody for attending and feel free to, and if you had friends who weren't able to make the live event, just know that this will be posted shortly on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to spread it around, highlight it, and please continue to look out at our social media and our website for all of the programs that are coming up in the future. Any last words you want to leave us with, Johnnie?
I just want to say thank you for this conversation. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of it, and for all the work that you and Dimitri have done behind the scenes and organizing it. I really appreciate you guys offering the space to artists to talk about their work and bring us into the conversation that's happening.
Thank you. With that, have a great afternoon.